Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Bill Sanders, the William D. and Nancy W. Dean of the College of Engineering. In fall of 2020, the College of Engineering kicked off a new webinar series called Faculty Insights, a 20-minute briefing, which we are holding 5 times per year. In this virtual series, faculty from the College of Engineering will share insights on their research, its impact, and perspectives for the future. Following each 20-minute presentation, attendees will have an opportunity to direct questions and comments to the speaker. Our speaker today is Professor Destenie Nock. She is an assistant professor of both civil and environmental engineering and engineering and public policy here at Carnegie Mellon University. She joined CMU in 2019 and has done a fantastic job since coming here. Destenie is a leader in energy justice, sustainable energy transition, trade-off analysis. Here at CMU, she creates optimization and decision analysis tools that evaluate the sustainability, the equity, and the reliability of power systems in the US and sub-Saharan Africa. In another project, she's creating a new measure of energy poverty to help utility companies identify energy limiting behavior in low-income households, a hidden form of energy poverty. Dr. Nock is also the CEO of People's Energy Analytics, a data-driven company which uses energy analytics to identify energy poverty in vulnerable households. She's also the CSO of DevStream. Prior to her current position at CMU, Destenie received her PhD in Industrial Engineering and Operations Research from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She has a MSc in Leadership for Sustainable Development from Queen's University in Belfast and 2 BS degrees in Electrical and Computer Engineering and Applied Math from North Carolina A&T State University. She is the creator of the Black Energy blog site, which posts articles about graduate and undergraduate advice and research updates in energy and sustainability. Destinie's presentation, entitled The Energy Equity Gap, Unveiling Hidden Energy Poverty, will discuss her work, which uses residential energy consumption data sets and algorithms to identify who cannot afford to use their air conditioners. Destenie, thank you for being here to share your research and insights. And before I turn things over to Destenie, please submit any questions you have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You may do this at any point in the program. Be sure to include your name with your question. Mara Kudrick, the Senior Development Officer for the College of Engineering, will be moderating these questions and with Destenie at the conclusion of this presentation. So Destenie, I'll turn it over to you, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Bill. And thanks to everyone who decided to join this Faculty Insights today. So we're going to be doing a deep dive into energy poverty analysis. And I would like to thank my collaborators, Shushen Kong, Jai Hunter-Hill, Christine Chow, Akuya Mitlilad, Lucy, and Bo for helping me with this research. So one of the things that I love to do is to ground the research into, who is impacted, why do we want to change the energy system in the first place? So my neighbor is an older woman in her 80s, and she actually had cancer. So one of the things that really surprised me during the pandemic was that she always had her windows open, and she fainted and ended up having to go to the hospital. So her energy burden, which is the percent of income that she spends on her energy bills, is very low because her air conditioner was broken. And there ended up being a lot of mold in her house. So she is one of those people that I think of when I think of an at-risk population. So this really helped me broaden my view of poverty because it's the state of one that lacks a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. So when I'm doing my research, a lot of times my question comes back to what is a socially acceptable amount of energy that we should expect people to be able to use in their homes? So energy poverty in the United States has typically been defined as the percent of income that a person spends on their energy bills. And this map here is showing you this energy burden. So that's what they call the percent of income they spend on your bills, where the lightest color on this graph represents census tracts that spend less than 6% of their annual income on their energy bills. And the darkest orange in this graph represents census tracts that are reporting spending more than 19% of their income on their energy bills. And so one thing we notice is, especially up top in Maine, there's a lot of oil heating. It's really expensive. So when we think about these cost and expenditure concerns and energy burden, that's like really the core of the circle. But then if you go one level out, you get into energy insecurity, which is really like a reliability and outage risk concerns. That's what we think of when we think of the Texas winter storm disaster. And then another layer out is energy poverty, where we get into supply concerns. And that's a lot of times what people think of when they hear lack of energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So in the US, because cost has dominated a lot of our discussions around energy poverty, one thing that often gets missed is that there's a lot of things that you have to pay for before you can actually get to paying your energy bill. So this graph here is a representation of a household that has one parent, two kids, and their gross income is $51,000. And so if we just calculate the energy burden on their gross income, then it looks like they spend about 4% of their income on their bills. But when we look at their net income, so after taxes, we see that it goes up to about 6%. So this is when they would start to cross that threshold and be deemed energy poor. But then after they pay their rent, their student debt, their vehicle costs, and then they have their commuting costs, and we want this family to eat, so we would also include some groceries, then the true fraction of their income that they spend on their energy bill, so their disposable income, is really about 32.2% of their income. And so it feels like a much heavier burden for this family. And another thing to also consider is that this household actually doesn't have any air conditioning units. So this is, the percent of income that they're spending just on their heating bills and window units. So this has led to, a different conceptualization of energy poverty. It's not just about your affordability, but it has this sandwich of different factors that can influence your feeling of energy poverty. So at the bottom of the sandwich, we have resource-based energy poverty, meaning do you have electricity in your home? And then if you do have electricity in your home, then you may experience reliability-based energy poverty, where you're asking, is the supply of electricity reliable? What are the number of outages that you're receiving? And then if you have it consistently all the time and it's in your home, then it's, can you afford to keep your house at a safe and comfortable temperature, right? So can you afford to use it all the time? And energy insecurity are those that can afford it most of the time, but they may have been at risk of being disconnected by their energy provider. And then the last piece of the sandwich, environmental, is, are you having negative health impacts from your consumption of energy? So do you live near polluting power plants? Are you burning trash in your home to stay warm, or trying to use your oven to stay warm? And so people may experience all or some of these forms of energy poverty. So now a lot of my work has been focused on trying to uncover some of these different facets of energy poverty, understanding that people's coping mechanisms may actually lead to a hidden form of energy poverty. Okay, So when we started this work, we looked at, we were first looking at heating, but then we realized that in the United States, there's actually a large risk that goes unnoticed in the cooling sector. So in Maricopa County in Arizona, between 2006 and 2016, there were 228 heat-related deaths that occurred indoors despite the presence of air conditioning units in all of those houses. And so there were 30 households that actually were disconnected from their electricity provider. 78 households turned off their working air conditioning unit because they felt like they couldn't afford the energy. And then 120 households actually had broken air conditioning units. And then this isn't just something that happens in the South. So in New York City, we also found that there were 38 heat-related deaths between 2011 to 2020, despite the presence of all of them having an air conditioning unit. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the heat-related death is really the extreme, but there are a lot of emergency room visits and at-risk populations that come online. So whenever you see these numbers, you need to multiply it by 12 or 20 for the number of emergency room visits that would just occur in the summer for heat-related illness. So this hidden inequity, there's on one hand, you're able to satisfy all of your demand, but at very high cost. That would be a high energy burden. And on the other side, we have you're unable to satisfy any of your demand, meaning that you may have outages or be disconnected. But in the middle, we have the people that get hidden between these two dominant energy poverty metrics. So those are people that may be able to satisfy partial needs, but may be at risk of either heat-related illness or at an extreme heat-related death. And so those are the people that we are trying to find using these algorithms. And this traditional based energy poverty metric, so energy burden that I've been talking about based on income, misses people's behavior and their tendency to cope and try to reduce their energy consumption to save money. So our study area that I'm going to talk about in this talk are the East Coast, this large box right here, and in Illinois, which is over here. And in Illinois, in case you haven't been there, the climate's pretty cold, and all along the East Coast, we're looking in the middle, so we have like a moderate climate. This map here is showing you the different power plants that we have in the United States. So purple is nuclear, blue is hydro, we got orange with some natural gas, and the yellow sprinkled in there is solar, and the black is coal. So our research process involves gathering household level utility data, and we match that with different demographic surveys. So we match that with a survey from the utility, but also census tract and zip code information. And then we also gather local temperature data to understand how people are using energy at different weather conditions. So then we'll calculate the household inflection temperature, which will be the temperatures at which they're going to turn on their air conditioner or heating systems. And then we calculate our energy equity gap for the year. So to give a nice visual for this, so along the y-axis, we have our electricity usage in households. And along the x-axis, we have our temperature. It's the outdoor temperature. And this here is going to be the output from one of our algorithms and regression models of energy usage in a home. And so this green here is going to represent a high income household. And what our regression does is it finds this cooling inflection temperature when the household turns on their AC unit. We also do the heating. We also do the heating inflection temperature as well. And then we will do this for all the households in our analysis. So this black at the bottom will be a low income household. And then we look for the energy equity gap, which is the difference between low and high income groups in their inflection temperatures, whether it be on the cooling side or on the heating side. And then we'll also do an analysis between the slopes that they have. So here I am presenting an output from our analysis in Chicago. And we see that in the lowest income group, group 1, so this is those that make less than $15,000 a year. And I just want to throw out there that $15,000 a year is the minimum wage. Okay, so if you were working a full-time minimum wage job, you would make about $15,000 a year. And then group 8 is the highest income group, so those that make more than $150,000 a year. And here we see that in the cooling side, that low income groups wait about 5 degrees longer than our high income group just to start using their cooling systems in Chicago. And oops, I should have said the energy equity gap is the maximum of the inflection temperatures, which here is 68 degrees, minus the minimum of the inflection temperatures, which here is 63 degrees. And that's how we get our 5-degree difference. Now, when we look at the heating sector in Chicago, one of the things that we notice is that there's actually the opposite effect. So here, our lowest income group starts using their heating systems at about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. And our highest income group starts using their heating systems about 51 degrees Fahrenheit. And actually we have another group, our third highest group, using it at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So this energy equity gap is actually an 8-degree difference in terms of Fahrenheit, in terms of the outdoor temperature. And so one of the questions is like, why would we see this opposite effect, right? Compared to the summer. And so one of the things that we hypothesize here is that housing characteristics and lack of insulation in older homes is going to play a large role in when people feel like they need to use their heating systems. So in the summer, during the hottest time of the day, you get to leave your house, right? You get to go to work, you can go to the park, you can go to the library. There's a lot of things open during the hottest time of the day, which means for residential energy use, people might be, pretty heat tolerant. But in the winter, we have the opposite effect, where during the coldest time of the day, you're stuck in your house, it's at night, and you don't have anywhere else to go. So then the primary coping mechanism would be not leaving your house, but instead actually adapting your thermostat. And so then we will see disparities in insulation, and your ability of your house to retain its thermal comfort reflected in differences in energy usage. So then we wanted to test to see if this hypothesis held in a more moderate climate. And so that's why we have worked with a utility company in the along the East Coast. Oops. So in our Mid-Atlantic region, when we looked at the cooling equity gap in 2018, we actually found that there was less of a gap. So the energy equity gap, so the lowest income group started cooling their homes about 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but then the highest income group started cooling at about 71 degrees Fahrenheit. So only a 3-degree difference, which is pretty interesting, but we suspect that's because it's a more moderate climate. But when we looked at the heating sector, we actually saw that there again was a small difference in when people would start using their heating systems. So here we notice that the lowest income group has a very wide distribution, but on average, the median is at 53 degrees and the median of the highest income group is about 55 degrees for that heating equity gap. But in 2019, so when people are, more stuck in their homes, we saw that the heating balance point actually widened to 5 degrees. And so that would be something that, we would talk with the electric utility about with coping. And so here we suspect that, the breeze from along the East Coast may actually make it feel colder in the winter during the day. And so that could be one reason why this gap is widening. And that's something that we plan on looking at further. Now, interestingly, when we looked at the longer term effects across the season, we saw that there actually was a huge difference in the slope of the graph. So for the slope, that is people's response to temperature over time. And so while in the Mid-Atlantic region, at the beginning of the season, we didn't see a wide disparity in when people would start to use their cooling and heating systems. What we notice is that when controlling for, household size and the number of air conditioning units in the home, there actually is still a very large gap in people's additional energy use as it's getting hotter and we're moving deeper into the summertime. Okay, so here this red box represents people that do not receive energy assistance, and the blue box represents those that do receive energy assistance. And along the y-axis, we have the cooling slope. So that's people's additional energy usage per degree of temperature increase. So we're moving deeper into the summer. And again, on the x-axis, we have income groups. So 1 is the lowest income group and 9 is the highest income group. And we notice that on the lowest income group, the median is about a 1. And then in the highest income group, this is about a 3. So, 3 additional units of energy per degree of temperature increase is a big difference from 1 that actually exceeds our energy efficiency expectations. And so that's something that we would, really need to consider as we are doing and incentivizing this energy transition. So it's not just about technology adoption, but once people adopt those technologies, do they feel like they can still afford to use them, especially as we're moving, into heat wave territory? So one of the big questions was, how might this energy limiting behavior have been complicated by the pandemic? And here I'm showing a graphic of our changes in hourly energy consumption on a percentage basis, which is along the x-axis here. And then we have some different demographic groups along the y-axis. So overall, we have Illinois in blue and Arizona in orange, low income, middle income, high income, and then white and minority. And one of the things that we saw was that if you just looked overall during the pandemic, then we saw a 4 to 6% increase in residential electricity consumption. But we see large differences between white and minority groups, particularly in southern states. So I'll just call Arizona here, where the using the electricity for cooling and heating significantly increased to actually it was like a 9% increase in minority areas, as opposed to about a 3.5 or 4% increase in white areas. And then in natural gas dominated Illinois, we saw less of a difference between minority and income groups. So these changes most likely stem from income changes. So along the left-hand side here, I have the income before the pandemic, and along the right side, I have income during the pandemic, and less income is actually at the top. And so one of the things that we noticed is that there was a large amount of unemployment occurring during the pandemic, which actually could lead to more people being at home, being stuck in their homes, right? And that's going to affect how much energy you're using in order to cope with the weather and natural events and climate change. And so one of the things that we asked people in a survey was, how have you changed your energy limiting behavior during the pandemic? So here on the y-axis, we have household income before the pandemic. And along the x-axis, we have percent of households in that income group. Now, the red, yellow, and orange here represents households that had an energy limit during the pandemic. And they may have either increased it or stayed the same during the pandemic. And then the blue households over here are those that had no energy limit before or during the pandemic. And so in our survey, after we did our survey, we noticed that in the four lowest income groups, about 50% of households report that they actively limit their energy consumption, right? And that is one thing that is, pretty surprising. So normally I think we tend to focus on the lowest income group when we think of energy assistance, but even in our, four lowest income groups, so people that are making minimum wage all the way up to more than double the minimum wage, we're seeing that people are feeling like they're unable to satisfy all of their energy demand. and that they're actively limiting their consumption in order to reduce financial strain. And so this is something that has previously been missed when we are talking about energy transition, because I think a lot of times we assume that the demand that we have now for energy is something that we need to project and predict for the future. But even now, there is a lot of unmet energy demand and needs. And that's something that, as we're moving forward, is really going to affect the number of solar panels we need to build, the number of wind turbines we're going to need to build, if we want to make sure that people can that we can have a reliable system and that people can use as much energy as they feel necessary to create a safe and healthy life. So to wrap it up, some policy implications are that the energy equity gap has captured the relative energy equity across a population, and that we are looking at coping behavior. So looking at people that have been left out of the traditional energy poverty measures that just focus on income, and trying to use behavior to understand who may be not able to create a safe and comfortable indoor environment in their home. And some future work is to dive deeper into how COVID-19 has affected people's energy use. We want to also look at developing other energy poverty metrics and help utility companies identify how infrastructure investments impact energy consumption and affordability. And so in conclusion, if you leave with nothing else from this talk, our energy equity gap captures human behavior and people's tendency to reduce their energy consumption to save money. And these people have previously been missed under traditional income-based measures. So I want to just throw out there that I love my team. These are my researchers. We work on commercializing this work at People's Energy Analytics, which is a spin out of Carnegie Mellon University. And here is more information about the company if you're interested. And thank you very much. So we have published the first part of this paper in Nature Communications, and this is my contact information, and I look forward to discussing more.
Oops. Sorry, I was on mute. I was thanking you, Dr. Nock, for your great insights and for taking the time to talk with us today. We'll now turn to our audience for questions. As a reminder, please submit your question via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and make sure to include your name with your question, which we already have a few that have been rolling in. I think it seems like we might have an expert here in the room from Francisco Barrias. They ask, as more folks move to solar power for their homes and even get credit for the extra power conducted, the burden to cover the cost of the grid will fall on fewer customers. The cost of the grid will stay the same or even increase, which means those who cannot afford to go to solar will not have to pay more. How do you think we can solve this problem?
Yeah, the age-old question of everybody who's worked in rate design, right? So I think that one of the biggest things that will end up happening in the industry is that we will be not just paying for our energy on a per unit basis anymore. And I think, those are some discussions I've heard just listening to utilities, right? I'm listening to people talking about how the industry is changing, because one of the challenges with people getting solar power on their homes is a lot of these homes remain connected to the grid, using the grid as their backup source of power. And so, right now, even if you're not using, all the units of energy from the grid, you do receive benefits from having that backup source. It adds to your reliability, right? The poles and wires are there regardless. And so, I've heard of adding in changing the way that they charge for transmission and distribution, not having it be a per kilowatt hour charge, but being a fixed charge. So if you, I don't know if you have a natural gas bill, but one of the things is so I used to live in a natural gas based home in Amherst when I went to grad school there. And we ended up having to pay $11 per month throughout the entire year, right? And that was just for having natural gas infrastructure connected to our house. But in the electricity side, we didn't really have that on our bill. And so that could be one potential avenue for that. I do think that with fewer customers on the grid paying for it, there might be less investment in maintaining that infrastructure. But the problem is when there is a big snowstorm, when there is like a lot of rain, then all those solar customers come back onto the grid. And, you know, oftentimes if they're a wealthier customer, right, they live in a more maintained part of the grid, but they haven't been paying for the infrastructure. And, you know, those conversations are popping up. And I think that they're very important conversations that we're going to have.
Maybe I'll just leave myself off mute since I'm having so much trouble. So what do you think is the biggest challenge for solving energy poverty?
I think that one of the challenges for solving energy poverty is trying to recognize and find all the people that are being affected by it, right? So that is that's one of the reasons why I started this research, right? Because there's a lot of people who are struggling with their bills. I mean, we know that. But when I talked to an energy assistance program director, she was telling me that some people in her program use so little energy that they might as well be living in a third world country, right? But they're living in the United States. So these are people that are potentially keeping their houses set at 40 degrees when it's 20 degrees outside, right? These are people that are setting their thermostats to 90 degrees in the summertime, right? And they may not live in like a shaded area, right? And they could be putting themselves at risk. And so when I was talking with this energy assistance program director, she was saying that, you know, that is one of the hardest things for me to find, because one of the things about being poor is nobody ever wants to say, hey, I'm poor. Like, I mean, I know I didn't when I was in grad school and we were cutting off our heating system when we left to go to work. And until our landlord came and said, hey, the house is too cold, and if the pipes freeze, you guys are going to be held liable, right? And I don't know if anybody has had their pipes freeze. I mean, we might have a couple of people in Pittsburgh that were here this Christmas, and it was very upsetting for a lot of us. I recently became a landlord, and my rental property, so we have a refugee family in there, and they didn't understand that you had to keep the heat on. And our pipes burst in that unit, and we're still trying to fix it, right? And they have kids, right? They had no running water for 3 days, and to fix it cost us $3,000, right? Just to like rip out all the pipes, but the kitchen is still unusable because we have to get another company in now to repair the kitchen because we had to rip all the cabinets off the wall to get to all the pipes. And so this is something that's very expensive, but these are not going to show up in energy bills, right? It's not going to show up in that cost. And so that's why I think that tying energy poverty with housing poverty and understanding, you know, who is affected, you know, how we can identify them, I think that that's going to be a really big challenge to solving this problem.
Thank you. And I hope that your issue gets resolved soon with the rental property. That sounds awful.
Yeah.
So we have another question, and this is related to the energy gap in Chicago. The gap is 5 degrees. Do you have data as to indoor temperatures the rooms are set for between income levels? And does income also determine if a home has a converter versus a traditional AC unit?
So for the energy equity gap, we actually do not have information on the thermostat that the rooms are set to. And I want to just throw out there why, even if we had that information, I don't think that it would completely solve our problem. So one of the things that we know about low income households is that they typically have, if they don't have an air conditioning unit, especially in northern states like Chicago, Massachusetts, et cetera, they will have window units, right? So they're not going to be setting a thermostat in every room. Also, if you have like a mini split, right? Or if it's like those boxes that sit in individual rooms, right? Then that information would most likely not come to the utility, because a lot of times the utility is going to get smart thermostat information. And so it'd be a programmable thermostat, which are going to be typically in the more higher income households. Now so with my data, we use household level energy data, specifically from the utility, and the response, so the difference in slope, so like if it's a very steep slope, then that would be like a centralized air conditioning unit across the entire house. But if it's like a very flat slope, then that can be a window unit, that can be a lot of fans, it can be a space heater. And so we will start to see that response in the different type of infrastructure in the steepness of the slope as we move deeper and deeper into the summer. So as the energy usage per degree temperature changes, that can give us an indication of cooling infrastructure in the home, heating infrastructure in the home. So that's one of the reasons why, even though we did think about trying to use smart thermostats, like we reached out to Google, for example, but when we talked to Google about using their Nest thermostat data, they actually informed us that we would not get the indication of poverty that we were looking for, because most of the people adopting programmable thermostats are from higher income groups. And so then you would most likely think that you didn't have a large amount of poverty, but it's because you would basically exclude anybody that only used fans in their home, anybody that only used, non-programmable window units, for example.
Oh, great, thank you. We have a question about safety. Is safety classified under reliability? And for example, if someone lived in an older building that wasn't up to code or had unsafe electrical connections. This is from a 1983 engineering alumni, Ron Josephson.
Sweet. So thanks, Ron, for asking that question. So under reliability, normally I'm specifically talking about electric grid reliability. So the number of hours that you would be without electricity in your home. So whether it's like a tree fell on your wires and they have to go fix it, or, there's some mismatch of supply and demand. For safety of like building codes and standards, that's more going to be on the housing poverty side, which actually would not be captured in my data set. I do not have information on if buildings are up to code or not in electric reliability data. So that data would not come from the utility. I think maybe getting that information from like a Zillow, type of company, or something else, but it would be more on like the housing side, which I think that housing poverty is directly tied to energy poverty. But currently the way that the government tries to, solve energy poverty has been very narrowly focused. And I think that broadening that focus is going to be a huge need.
Great, thank you. I see that one of my friend's brothers, who is a metallurgy alumni from the College of Engineering and now turned lawyer, Matt Adler, he says he's a longtime fan and a first-time caller. He would like to ask about the methodology for the study. You had data from electric companies regarding household usage. How did you get data on the number of air conditioning units, and what assumptions did you have to make about energy consumption and usage of air conditioners? And he has an example. If people had fans they use before they turn on their AC, is that a consideration?
So, hi, Matt. Thanks for being a longtime fan. So for the air conditioning units, when we did our study in Arizona, the utility actually gave us information on the number of air conditioning units in each of those houses. So they gave us the number, they tied it directly with the house. They had done a very extensive survey on that. With the other two areas, so in the Mid-Atlantic region and in Chicago, we actually did not have information on the number of air conditioning units in the home, but what we did under the assumption was that we assumed that it would be able to be found in the slopes changes. And so when we are looking at the different households, one of the things that we were mainly controlling for was heating type. And so we had information on if it's a natural gas-based heating home or an electric-based heating home. And we found that that was going to be a much bigger factor in the regression analysis for the home than we than like the number of AC units, because even when we were controlling in Arizona for the number of AC units, we saw that there was this large slope difference when we looked at income groups. We saw that across the entire population and when we tried to segment it. But yeah, so long story short, in Arizona, the utility gave us that information. In Delaware, in the Middle Atlantic region, and in Chicago, we did not have the information, but we had it for heat.
Great, great. And all of your answers are just leading to more questions here. So we have some great dialogue. Utility planning often uses a weighted temperature humidity index to consider inflection points. Was this metric used in your analysis?
So you said that the utility uses a weighted temperature humidity index. So we did, let's see. Oh, so in Arizona, because it's a very dry climate, we did not include the humidity index. In Delaware and Chicago, we definitely were planning to, and I will definitely check with my student to make sure that that happened. But we were using not the humidity index, but what we call like the wet bulb temperature. So that is the temperature accounting for humidity in it, which I believe would get to the same effect that you are talking about. But in Arizona, in that first paper we published, did not, because it's a very dry climate. But in Delaware, we definitely had talked about using the wet bulb temperature to account for differences in humidity.
As they say, it's a dry heat in Arizona.
Yeah, and I'm from Maryland, and there's no such thing as a dry heat.
Well, I mean, Pittsburgh is just as the same thing.
Yeah.
We have another question, and they said, apologies if this was covered, but how could incentives for heat pumps, building retrofits, or other efficiency-related incentives be used to reduce energy poverty? And would any of these solutions be effective?
So for achieving a just and sustainable energy transition, I do think that energy technology deployments are going to be huge for reaching equity, because the slope of how you're able to use more energy as you're going deeper into the summer or deeper into the winter is going to be directly affected by how much it's going to cost you to use that extra unit of energy. Now, one of the things that some people on this webinar may have heard of is the rebound effect, right? People talk about it like it's a really bad thing. They say, oh, well, these households got an energy efficient technology, and now all of a sudden they're using more energy. This is terrible. But that's actually not true, because in some households, so in the low income households, there are people that are struggling to try to keep their houses very warm. And there's a large amount of energy that they want to use that they feel like they just can't afford to use. So when they get energy efficient technologies, yes, they use more, but it's because they always wanted to, right? And so I do think that energy efficient technologies can be very good at lowering that gap between high and low income groups. And we will have to, as like an energy community, and as we're transitioning, talk about, in some cases, that rebound effect looks like a bad thing, because, in some households, now people just have 2 refrigerators, they got 2 cars, right? They're just adopting a lot more technologies. But in other households, when you're deploying heat pumps, you're deploying efficient air conditioning and heating systems, they are going to use more, but it's actually the alleviation of poverty, right? And that's something that we are still trying to disaggregate in a new data set. So stay tuned for the years to come. But I do think that energy efficient technologies and updating it and making sure that it's efficient is going to be important for reducing poverty.
Great. Well, you have another fan on here. It looks like Eric Cheek would like to wish Dr. Nock congratulations, and says that your former professor has enjoyed hearing this and will see you during Spring Carnival. So
sweet.
That's great.
Hey, Dr. Cheek. He taught me circuits. So.
There you go. There you go. Very important. Let's see. Michael has asked if you have thought of additional grant money to present the monetary side of your terrific data set. This presumes actionable information would be had.
So Michael, if you have additional grant money that you would love to throw my way, I would be happy to go down on look at any source to do that. I actually, a fun fact about this work is that it is the work that actually has not been directly funded by grants. So I think that sometimes, right, doing meaningful work, you finagle it. So we actually, this work actually started as a COVID-19 project to identify people that were not able to, that were unsafe in their homes during COVID, right? And so we got a 1-year grant to do that. And that was back in 2020. And then now we have some money to look at disconnection. So people that are at risk of being disconnected from their utility provider. But I do think that there is a lot of unknowns about energy usage, right? How much people are using in their homes, and understanding like the monetary side of, how does energy assistance, right, impact energy usage? And I think that there's a lot of questions to explore. So yes, I have really wanted to get additional grant money to continue this work, because I do think that understanding who is under consuming energy is going to be really important as we transition, because there's, I think, a lot of people that feel like they can't afford it. And right now, I think a lot of the work has been focused on the over consumers of energy, right? That's really dominated the narrative of, we need to use less. We got to get people to use less energy, but we don't have a good grasp of when is less achieved, right? So people will say we need, energy efficient technologies to reduce our energy load, but the question is, reduce it to what, right? And I think that takes me back to when I was talking with the energy assistance program director, like from the government, saying that there are some people in her region consuming so little that they might as well be living in a developing country with no car, no microwave, no refrigerator. She's like, I don't understand how people can be using so little and still live in the United States. And I think that that's a conversation that isn't often had in the United States, because nobody wants to admit that they're poor, right? Nobody wants to admit that they, don't turn, like they turn their heat off when they go to work, and they don't want to come home because they're keeping their thermostat set to 35 degrees or 40 degrees when it's 20 degrees outside.
Right. Well, to circle back to funding needs, I would not be doing my job if I didn't mention that we're very happy to talk with people who want to support this type of research. You can create specific research funds for this type of work, and happy to follow up with you on that. Let's see here. We'll take a couple more questions. This has been very lively. Thank you to everyone who has taken the time to ask such great questions. Let's see. Oh, look, someone who's been asking a lot of questions is a proud Tartan dad. This is great. So we even have some parents on here. Do you think that folks would be inclined to allow thermometers networked to a Wi-Fi system to report indoor temperatures? Because I know you spoke about Nest and other systems that are on Wi-Fi. Do you think that would be something that could help?
I do. I feel like that there are people who don't mind having these thermostats networked to, send data to the utility. We also have seen some demand response programs coming online to try to help the utilities manage their loads. And then I think that some customers are interested in participating in those programs because of the, payback that they get for being a participant. One of the things that I think this work could open up is a lot of times we hear about the duck curve, right? So if you haven't heard about it, it's in the morning, you have this peak when everybody's waking up and getting ready for work and the industry is getting ready. And then in the middle, as we deploy more solar, so like the energy is making this big valley, right? And the utility is really worried about this, death spiral of their middle of the day energy usage. And then we need a large ramping at the end of the day when people are getting off of work, the sun is setting, and people are coming back home. So with this duck curve, utilities are worried about the middle of the day, all the solar's online, and we're not using enough. But we know that there are people that are in their homes not using enough, right? So I do think that this, like smart thermostats and demand response programs with the utilities and this wireless network of connected thermostats could create a more fair system where, we could have households participate in a program, and if the utility keeps their house between a certain temperature, right, and they're allowed to move it up and down to shift the demand a little bit, then that can help not only balance out the load, we'll be using more solar, right, so we may not have as high of a peak in the end of the day because people's homes will already be warm when they get home, or already be cool in the summer, and it would be good for just safety, right, because we have households that can't consume enough. So I do think that, technology adoption, smart thermostats, wireless network of thermostats has great potential for aiding the energy transition, especially if we're going to really focus on getting to 100% renewable energy transition.
Great. Well, Dr. Nock, this is great. I have not seen a webinar with this many interactive questions. So you're doing a great job, and we have time for one more question, but just so everyone knows that we are tracking these questions and we will share them with Dr. Nock, and hopefully when we send a follow-up, we'll be able to address some of these questions, or at least provide links to research. So for your last question, which comes from another CMU alumni from the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, Dawning Wu. Dawning asks, does this inform how new construction should be done, driving development of more energy equitable criteria, maybe depending on where the house is and the weather and climate in that area?
So I do think that it can inform new builds of energy, new buildings, and how we are thinking about, what to build them with, right? If one of the things is, when I lived in Massachusetts, our landlord was not required to provide cooling infrastructure, right? So we weren't required to provide an air conditioning unit, window units, or anything. And I actually was at one point having a scare because I lived on the second floor of the house, and it was so hot. I mean, the heat wave was lasting for a week and a half, and there was a point where I almost had to go to the hospital because I just couldn't stay cool enough in the home, and I just started sleeping downstairs in the living room, right, to the detriment of my roommates at the time, right? But I felt like I could not afford to buy a window unit as a grad student. And so when we are thinking about new constructions, right, like requirements for landlords, like building codes, safety, I do think that understanding, like, when we're building houses, like what are the insulation requirements, especially if we're thinking about like a colder climate, we saw a much wider gap, right, in the heating turn-on point in the Chicago, Illinois region than we did in the Mid-Atlantic region. But in the Mid-Atlantic region, right, like that might not be a big concern. And so when we're trying to solve like, energy poverty and trying to make sure that we are being equitable in terms of our energy system build out, I do think that in the United States, we have to recognize that different climate zones, right, the North versus the South versus the coast, are going to lead to very different needs in terms of the energy system. Sometimes when I'm presenting this work, some people in California tell me, well, I have really high ceilings and it doesn't feel hot when it's 90 degrees outside. And I'm like, that's because you have high ceilings, right? Like those are meant to make it easier. And also in California, right, like you're on the coast, whereas it's going to be very different in Arizona and Texas, right, in the Midwest. It's going to feel very different, especially if you're not in a shaded area. And so I think that with, new construction, thinking about shading, window quality, right, insulation quality, I think that those are really going to be important, especially when we're thinking about like climate adaptation strategies and helping people adapt to climate change. If you look at the policies, the main adaptation strategy for climate change is to use energy, right? We have more efficient air conditioning units, we have heat pumps, right? Using more energy. And I think that understanding how the types of houses we build will impact people's energy use is going to be vital in order to make sure that we can provide an equitable energy future. I think it will also be important for when we are restoring old houses, right? Retrofitting buildings, understanding that I think will also play a large role.
Great. Well, fantastic work. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and for asking your questions. Dr. Nock, it was extremely thought-provoking and informative. And I just thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your enthusiasm and the really excellent work that you're doing. To our participants, please keep an eye out for a follow-up email soon, which will include a link to the recording from this session. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we hope to see everyone back here for Carnival. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for coming.